Chapter 21. The Rise of Progressivism. The progressive impulse. Society is capable of growth and advancement, so it must be orderly rather than chaotic. Some of the impulses were anti-monopoly, a fear of concentrated power, and social cohesion, which was welfare of one is dependent on welfare of all. They had a faith in knowledge. They applied sciences to society, and organization and efficiency as well as equality and humane treatment. Muckrakers focused on exposing scandal, corruption, and injustice to the public view. They targeted trusts and railroads. They revealed social problems to the public and inspired people to take action. One such muckraker was Ida Tarbell. She studied the Standard Oil Trust. Lincoln Steffens studied the urban political bosses. Progressivists were in pursuit of social justice, and they also inspired social gospel, which was about religion and reform in cities. Protestant Walter Rauschenbusch said that human salvation is possible through Christian reform, as well as the humanitarian evolution of society. Catholic John Ryan worked to expand Catholic social welfare organizations. There's the influence on the environment on individual development. A response to that was the Settlement House, which sought to help immigrant families adapt to languages and customs. The most famous was Hull House, founded by Jane Addams. There were increasing roles for women in settlement houses and social work. Thorstein Veblen suggests a new economic system in which power is held by engineers, and society is governed by a machine process. Taylorism, aka scientific management, leads to a revolution in education, social science, and more organization. In education, the demand for professionals increases, and there are pressures to reform. The American Medical Association is for medicine to establish a competence standard. The National Association of Manufacturers is for business. Female-dominated professions, aka domestic professions, include settlement houses, social work, teaching, nursing, and sometimes even academia. Women and reform. Technology makes life easier in the home, so there's a declining family size and a longer lifespan, so there are more activities outside the home. 10% of women are single. They gain better roles in life and they become reformers. And education of women leads to reform in female communities. Women's clubs began as cultural organizations and an intellectual outlet for middle and upper class. There was the General Federation of Women's Clubs. However, they went from culture to social betterment. However, their presence is difficult for the politicians to ignore, so they do have an influence. The black women formed the National Association of Colored Women. Such clubs gave women of female community find a place without challenging the male-dominated order. The Children's Bureau was dedicated to protecting children. And the women's clubs gave rise to regulations for women and child labor, workplace inspection, Indian policies, housing, and alcohol. The Women's Trade Union League, women's efforts were dependent on males. However, they said that women deserve the same rights as men, particularly the right to vote. However, men thought this challenged the female sphere. So there was an anti-suffrage movement. There were men against the threat to the national order. The National American Women's Suffrage Association grew quickly. Because of women's distinct place in society, they could contribute to politics. Reasons for suffrage: they could help the Temperance Movement, help end war. All the other groups of men can vote, so we should too. More political support for other issues as well. Women's suffrage first began in the West because they needed those people to be able to become a state. The 19th Amendment grants political rights to women in 1920. However, Alice Paul suggests the Equal Rights Amendment. However, it does not have much support. And in general, the feminist movement accomplishes not much more than the right to vote. So essentially, Alice Paul wanted more rights than just political rights. Then we move on to the assault on the parties. The Progressives wanted the government to carry out reforms. Let's reform the government and the party system. They started with attacks on party dominance, such as greenbackism, populism, mugwumps, Indian Republicans, and they wanted to challenge partisanship. The secret ballot, in which government printed the ballots, people filled and deposited them in secret, as opposed to political parties handing out their ballots. This helped decrease power of the parties over voters. The party rule could be broken by increasing power of the people or putting power in the hands of nonpartisan officials. The municipal government was the first target. They challenged city bosses, entrenched political organizations, and groups of special interests. The commission plan, in which officials are replaced with a nonpartisan commission. The city manager plan, in which officials hire an outside expert to control the government, in theory, would be untainted by corruption. Nonpartisan elections, which gave rise to many successful reformers from progressive-controlled political structures, such as Tom Johnson in Cleveland. So then they turned to the state government. Let's circumvent the boss-controlled legislature and increase the electorate power. The initiative, in which the legislation is submitted to voters rather than the legislature. Referendum, in which actions of legislature are returned to the electorate for approval. We did this. Do you approve? Direct primary, selection of candidates by the people rather than the bosses. Recall. Voters can remove officials from office during a special election, which is called for if enough people petition. So there's a limiting influence of corporations on legislatures. And there's injury compensation, widower's pension. One particular reformer, Robert M. La Follette, was particularly influential in turning Wisconsin into a lab of progressivism. He was effective in publicizing the message of reform. So there's a declining party influence, but there's also a decline in voter turnout. And there's a rise in interest groups, organizations outside the party system that pressure the government to do their bidding. Sources of progressive reform. Union and labor groups like the Union Labor Party pressure the government to pass working condition laws. Urban bosses and machines change to help social reform. This also leads to laws for working conditions and eliminating abuses of the industrial economy. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire spurs improvement of working conditions and increases influence of women in reform. Western reformers target the federal government because of its role in water disputes and its power over resources and high percent of ownership over land. So there's less power in the state and local governments. So political parties weaken in the West, and there are quicker reforms. As far as African American reform is concerned, we have two main men, Booker T. Washington, to begin with, he focuses on self-improvement rather than long-range social change. He's like, we should work our way up to be equal to the white man, and he will accept us. That's his theory of the Atlantic Compromise. Then we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who advocates fighting for immediate restoration of civil rights, not waiting around. Blacks and whites joined together to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is headed by W.E.B. Du Bois. The Supreme Court case Gwynne versus the U.S. rules the Grandfather Clause unconstitutional, and the Buchanan versus Worley struck down laws requiring residential segregation. Crusade for social order and reform. So people notice that drunkenness causes a lot of problems. So this leads to the Temperance Movement. And the saloon is central to the urban machine, so if you attack the saloons, then you attack the bosses. So you get two birds with one stone. With the Women's Christian Temperance Union, publicized the evils of alcohol and the connections between drunkenness and many issues such as crime and poverty. The Anti-Saloon League wanted to legally abolish saloons and thus alcohol sales. So the 18th Amendment institutes the prohibition of alcohol. Then we have immigrants who cause problems in society. So should we assimilate them or should we limit them coming into the country? Many people thought that immigrants were polluting the nation's racial stock. So the eugenics movement grades races and ethnic groups. And immigrants are multiplying the unfit qualities of the American race. Madison Grant was a nativist who warned of the immigrants polluting the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race. The Dillingham Report said that the new immigrant groups are less assimilable than the older ones, and that immigration should be restricted by nationality. Challenging the capitalist order. The Socialist Party gained strength. They had a candidate, Eugene Debs, but he won hundreds of thousands of votes, but nowhere near enough to win an election. Lincoln Steffens was a crusader against municipal corruption. The Socialists said there was a need for structural changes in the economy. However, they had different ideas how. There was the militant radical labor union, Industrial Workers of the World, and the supporters were known as Wobblies. They advocated a single union for all workers, use of the strike, and championed the cause of the unskilled workers. There was a 1917 strike on timber. So the federal government outlaws the IWW, and socialism is on the decline. Later on. Louis D. Brandeis, I don't know how you pronounce that, but Brandeis said that bigness in the government, like economic concentration, limited efficiency and freedom. Other progressives said we should distinguish between the good and bad trusts. So, and in the nationalist view, economic consolidation is permanent, and there's a strong modernized government necessary. And Herbert Croly supported this nationalist view in his book, The Promise of American Life. Next time, national reform.